Some bonds run deeper than blood, deeper than death itself. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the Amarillo kill pen that sweltering July morning in 1987, where dozens of broken-down horses waited for their final ride to the slaughterhouse. 8-year-old Caleb Morrison pressed his face against the chain-link fence, his grandfather's weathered hand resting on his shoulder as they surveyed the tragic scene. Most folks saw nothing but old nags and discarded dreams, but Caleb possessed something rare, an almost supernatural ability to see straight into a horse's soul. Then he spotted him, a black stallion, barely alive, standing apart from the others with a dignity that defied his skeletal frame. Something about those eyes made Caleb's heart race with recognition he couldn't explain. When he begged his grandfather to rescue the $200 horse, he had no idea he was about to uncover a family secret that would shake him to his core. This wasn't just any horse. This was a ghost from his family's past, bearing scars and memories that should have died in a barn fire 20 years ago. What Caleb discovered would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and the unbreakable bonds that tie us to those we love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb's small fingers gripped the rusty chain link until his knuckles turned white. The metallic tang of blood and fear hung heavy in the morning air, mixing with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust from the transport trucks that would arrive by noon. Around him, 37 horses, he'd counted them twice, stood in various stages of defeat. Some had given up entirely, heads hanging low, ribs showing through dull coats. Others still paced nervously, sensing what awaited them. But the black stallion stood perfectly still. "Granddad," Caleb whispered, never taking his eyes off the horse. "Look at him. Really look." Henry Morrison adjusted his straw hat and squinted through the fence. At 72, he'd seen more horses than most men saw sunsets, but he trusted his grandson's instincts more than his own failing eyesight. The boy had been born with a gift. Horses that bucked off seasoned cowboys were gentle under Caleb's touch, like they were meeting an old friend. "He's pretty far gone, son," Henry said softly. "Probably why he's in here. Somebody's cutting their losses." The stallion's black coat had faded to a dusty charcoal, stretched tight over prominent ribs and jutting hip bones. Scars crisscrossed his legs and flanks, some old and silver, others still raw and pink. His mane hung in tangled mats, and his hooves were cracked and overgrown. Any reasonable person would see a lost cause, but Caleb saw something else entirely. He saw the way the horse held his head high, despite his condition, ears pricked forward with an alertness that spoke of intelligence rather than fear. He saw how the other horses gave him space, not out of aggression, but respect. Most of all, he saw something in those dark eyes that made his chest tighten with a strange familiarity he couldn't name. "What's his story, you reckon?" asked Jake Weatherby, the kill pen operator who'd been trailing behind him like a persistent shadow. His clothes reeked of cigarettes and desperation. The monthly sale was his bread and butter, and Henry Morrison's reputation as a soft touch for rescue horses made him a valuable customer. "Found him up near the Panhandle," Jake continued, lighting another cigarette. "Some rancher said he'd been hanging around his property for weeks, wouldn't let nobody near him. Half dead from starvation, but still had too much fight in him to be useful. Figured he was some Mustang that wandered down from Colorado." Caleb pressed closer to the fence. "Can I go in?" "Absolutely not," Henry said firmly. "That horse is half wild and desperate. Please, Granddad. Just for a minute." Henry looked down at his grandson, all 90 pounds of him, wearing boots too big for his feet and a determination too large for his age. The boy's mother had died when he was 3, and his father, well, that was a pain Henry carried like a stone in his chest every day. Caleb was all he had left of his son Thomas, and the thought of losing him to some broken-down stallion made his stomach clench. But there was something in the boy's voice, a quiet certainty that reminded Henry powerfully of Thomas at that age. His son had possessed the same uncanny connection with horses, the same ability to see past the surface to something deeper. 5 minutes, Henry said finally. "You stay close to the gate, and if that horse so much as flicks an ear wrong, you come straight back." Jake fumbled with his keys, muttering about insurance and liability, but a $20 bill from Henry's wallet solved his concerns quickly enough. The gate creaked open, and Caleb stepped into the pen. The other horses stirred nervously, but the black stallion remained motionless, watching the small boy approach with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Caleb moved slowly, the way his father had taught him in memories so faded they felt like dreams. He kept his hands visible, his breathing steady, his thoughts calm. The stallion's nostrils flared, reading the boy's scent, his intentions, his heart. When Caleb was still 10 feet away, the impossible happened. The stallion took a step toward him, then another. His movements were stiff and painful, but deliberate, purposeful. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered. "I know you. Somehow I know you." The stallion stopped just within arm's reach, his great head lowering until he was looking directly into Caleb's eyes. For a moment that stretched like eternity, boy and horse studied each other with the intensity of souls recognizing something familiar, something that defied explanation. Then Caleb reached out and placed his small hand on the stallion's scarred neck, and the horse leaned into his touch like he'd been waiting his whole life for exactly that moment. Behind the fence, Henry Morrison felt his breath catch in his throat. It was impossible, but the scene before him looked exactly like something from 20 years ago. His son Thomas with his beloved stallion, Midnight. The same black coat, the same proud bearing, even the same distinctive white star barely visible beneath the matted forelock. But that horse was dead. Henry had seen the smoking remains of the barn himself, had helped bury what little they'd found. Hadn't he? The drive back to the ranch stretched 30 miles through nothing but heat, shimmer, and stubborn hope. The horse trailer bounced and swayed behind Henry's pickup, carrying $200 worth of questions that neither grandfather nor grandson seemed ready to ask aloud. Caleb pressed his face against the passenger window, watching the familiar landmarks roll by. The rusted mailbox marking the old Henderson place, the crooked fence post where lightning had struck twice, the faded billboard advertising a rodeo from 1983 that nobody had bothered to take down. This was his world, measured in fence lines and cattle guards, bounded by horizons that seemed infinite until you tried to escape them. "What are we going to call him?" Caleb asked, his breath fogging the glass. Henry kept his eyes on the road, but his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "Seems to me a horse like that already has a name. Question is whether we'll ever know what it is." The Morrison Ranch appeared as it always did, gradually, like hope emerging from desperation. First the windmill, its blades turning lazily in the afternoon breeze, then the weathered barn, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The house sat beyond it, a modest 2-story structure that had sheltered 3 generations of Morrisons through dust storms, market crashes, and personal tragedies that cut deeper than any drought. Caleb loved every board and nail of it, even the parts that were falling apart, especially those parts. They made the ranch feel real, lived in, earned through decades of sweat and stubbornness. The peeling paint on the porch steps, the screen door that hung slightly crooked, the way the floorboards in the kitchen creaked in a pattern he'd memorized by heart. These imperfections were what made it home. But loving something and keeping it were 2 different things entirely. "Bank called again yesterday," Henry said as they pulled up to the barn. He tried to make it sound casual, like he was mentioning the weather, but Caleb had learned to read the tightness around his grandfather's eyes. "What did you tell them?" "Same thing I always tell them, that we'll make the payment when the cattle sell." Henry cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the barn as if he could will it back to its former glory. "Course they're starting to sound less interested in my promises and more interested in our land." Caleb climbed out of the truck, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a familiar thud. The afternoon heat rose up from the ground in visible waves, but there was comfort in its intensity. This was Texas heat, honest and unforgiving, the kind that separated the strong from the stubborn. He'd been born into it, raised by it, and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The ritual of unloading the stallion should have been chaotic. Most horses came off trailers nervous and disoriented, especially ones pulled from kill pens. But the black horse stepped down with an odd dignity, as if he recognized where he was. His head turned slowly, taking in the barn, the pastures, the house in the distance, and something in his posture suggested not confusion but remembrance. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, leading him toward the barn. "You're safe now." The barn held the accumulated sense of 60 years, hay dust and leather, horse sweat and saddle oil, memories soaked so deep into the wood that they'd become part of its structure. Caleb breathed it in like a prayer. This was where his grandfather had taught him to ride, where he'd learned to read a horse's moods in the set of its ears and the swish of its tail, where he'd spent countless hours dreaming of the day he'd be old enough to work the ranch as more than just Henry's eager shadow. But it was also where his father had died. Caleb tried not to think about the fire that had taken Thomas Morrison and his stallion 20 years ago. Henry rarely spoke of it, and the physical evidence had long since been cleared away and rebuilt. Yet sometimes, on still nights when the wind died down completely, Caleb imagined he could smell smoke that had no source, hear the echo of screams that belonged to ghosts. They settled the stallion in the largest stall, the one that got the best crossbreeze and had a clear view of the pastures beyond. The horse moved stiffly but without complaint, and when Caleb filled the water trough, he drank with the measured control of an animal who'd learned not to waste anything precious. "He's been someone's horse," Henry observed, watching from the stall door. "Look how he stands, how he moves. This isn't some wild Mustang. Somebody trained him, loved him, spent time with him. So what happened? How'd he end up in that place?" Henry was quiet for a long moment, studying the stallion with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "Sometimes the world takes things from us, son. Sometimes we lose what we love most, and it ends up in places it was never meant to be." The old man's voice carried a weight that made Caleb look up sharply, but Henry had already turned away, heading back toward the house where supper waited, and bills needed paying, and tomorrow's problems demanded attention. Caleb lingered in the barn as shadows lengthened across the stalls. Tomorrow he'd start the real work of bringing the stallion back to health, but tonight he simply wanted to sit with the mystery of this horse who felt like coming home. The morning came too soon and not soon enough. Caleb had barely slept, his mind churning with images of the stallion standing so still in that kill pen, the way those dark eyes had seemed to recognize him. He'd risen before dawn, dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, and crept downstairs, past his grandfather's room where Henry's snores rattled the old house like a freight train. The barn felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, older somehow, heavy with secrets that daylight usually kept at bay. Caleb moved quietly between the stalls, checking on their handful of remaining horses, but his steps inevitably carried him to the largest stall where the black stallion waited. The horse was awake, standing alert despite his obvious exhaustion. When he saw Caleb, his ears pricked forward, and he moved to the stall door with that same strange purposefulness he'd shown yesterday. "Morning, boy," Caleb whispered, reaching through the rails to touch the stallion's neck. "How you feeling?" The horse leaned into his touch, and Caleb felt that peculiar sensation again, like touching something familiar, something that belonged to him in ways he couldn't explain. He was reaching for the stall latch when a voice behind him made him jump. "Figured I'd find you here." Henry stood in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the growing light. He carried 2 cups of coffee, and the kind of serious expression that usually meant trouble. "Couldn't sleep either, I reckon," Henry continued, handing Caleb one of the cups. The coffee was strong and black, the way ranchmen had been drinking it since before Caleb was born. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the stallion. In the growing light, Caleb could see details he'd missed yesterday. The precise pattern of scars on the horse's legs, the way his left ear had a small notch taken out of it, the exact placement of that white star beneath his forelock. "Granddad," Caleb said slowly, "tell me about my father's horse again, the one that died in the fire." Henry's cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Why are you asking about that?" "Just tell me. Please." Henry was quiet for so long that Caleb wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a man walking through a minefield. Midnight was your daddy's pride and joy. Black stallion, about 16 hands high. Had a white star right here, Henry touched his own forehead, and a scar on his left shoulder from where he tangled with some barbed wire as a colt. Thomas found him wild up in the panhandle, spent months gentling him. That horse would do anything for your daddy. Follow him around like a dog, come when called, stand still as stone while Thomas worked cattle from his back. Caleb's hand tightened on his coffee cup. What happened the night of the fire? Lightning strike, far as we could tell. Whole south end of the barn went up like kindling. Your daddy tried to get the horses out, but... Henry's voice cracked slightly. Found them both in Midnight's stall. Thomas must have gone back for him. What did Midnight look like exactly, besides the star and the shoulder scar? Henry turned to study his grandson's face. Why these questions, Caleb? Instead of answering, Caleb opened the stall door and stepped inside. The stallion moved toward him immediately, lowering his great head so Caleb could reach his forehead. With gentle fingers, the boy parted the matted hair of the forelock, revealing the white star beneath. Same star, Caleb said quietly. Lots of horses have stars, son. Caleb moved to the stallion's left side, running his hands along the scarred shoulder until he found what he was looking for. A raised line of scar tissue in the exact shape Henry had described. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he knew the importance of this moment. Same scar. Henry's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the barn floor. That's impossible. We buried... What if you were wrong? Caleb's voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the barn. What if somehow, some way, this is Midnight? The stallion turned his head to look directly at Henry, and the old man stumbled backward as if he'd been struck. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and horse stared at each other across 20 years of grief and loss, and questions that had never been answered. Then Henry was moving, his boots echoing on the barn floor as he strode toward the house with the determined gait of a man who'd made a decision he should have made long ago. "Where are you going?" Caleb called after him. "To get your father's journal," Henry replied without slowing down. "If this horse is who you think he is, then there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago." Caleb stood alone in the stall with the stallion, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever his grandfather was about to reveal, whatever secrets that journal contained, he knew his ordinary world was about to change forever. The horse nickered softly and nudged his shoulder, as if to say, "Finally." Caleb watched his grandfather's retreating figure until it disappeared into the house, then slumped against the stall wall as if someone had cut his strings. The stallion stood beside him, warm and solid and impossible, breathing quietly in the growing dawn light. What if this is Midnight? The thought terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Not because he didn't believe it, deep in his bones, in some place that lived beyond logic, Heck knew it was true, but because if this horse really was his father's stallion, then everything he'd been told about that night 20 years ago was a lie. And if they'd lied about the horse, what else had they lied about? Caleb's hands shook as he stroked the stallion's neck. He'd spent 8 years building his world on the foundation of what Henry had told him, that his father was a hero who died trying to save his horses, that sometimes tragedy struck like lightning and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Simple, tragic, final, but nothing about this felt simple anymore. The stallion turned his great head to study Caleb with those dark, knowing eyes, and the boy felt exposed, like the horse could see straight through to his fears. Because underneath his excitement at this impossible reunion was something that made his stomach churn, the creeping certainty that he wasn't ready for whatever truth his grandfather was about to reveal. What if his father's death wasn't an accident? What if someone had wanted Thomas Morrison dead, and the fire had been a convenient cover? What if there were people out there who'd killed once and wouldn't hesitate to kill again to protect their secrets? Caleb was just a kid. He could gentle horses and fix fence, and read the sky for weather, but he didn't know how to fight grown-up battles or uncover 20-year-old conspiracies. The very idea of it made him feel small and helpless in ways he hated. And then there was the ranch. If pursuing this truth somehow made things worse with the bank, if it brought the kind of trouble that finished off what was left of their family's legacy. Caleb pressed his face against the stallion's warm neck, breathing in the scent of hay and horsehide and something else, something that might have been memory itself. They could lose everything. The only home he'd ever known, the only life he'd ever wanted, was solving a 20-year-old mystery worth risking the future he'd dreamed of since he was old enough to sit a saddle. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered to the stallion. "I'm just a kid. What if I make everything worse?" The horse nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry infinite patience, and Caleb remembered something his grandfather had told him once. Sometimes the hardest thing about growing up isn't learning what you can do. It's learning what you have to do, even when you don't want to. But Henry had secrets too. Big ones, apparently. Caleb had always trusted his grandfather completely, had built his understanding of the world on Henry's steady presence and quiet wisdom. Now that foundation felt shaky, like everything he thought he knew was built on sand. What if Henry had been lying to him his whole life? What if his grandfather wasn't the man Caleb thought he was? The sound of the screen door slamming made him jump. Through the barn's open doorway, he could see Henry walking back across the yard, carrying something dark and leather-bound against his chest like it might explode. His grandfather's face looked older somehow, carved with lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. Caleb's first instinct was to run, to slip out the back of the barn and keep walking until he reached somewhere that didn't have ghosts and secrets and impossible horses that remembered things they shouldn't remember. Somewhere simple and safe where 8-year-old boys only had to worry about 8-year-old problems. But his father's journal was getting closer with every step Henry took, and with it, answers to questions Caleb hadn't even known he should be asking. The truth about what really happened that night, the truth about why this horse was still alive, the truth about what kind of man his father really was, and what kind of enemies he might have made. The stallion shifted beside him, and Caleb felt the solid warmth of muscle and bone, the steady rhythm of breathing that had somehow survived 20 years when it should have died in flames. This horse had endured things that should have broken him, had somehow found his way back to the place where he belonged. Maybe that was what courage really meant. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going even when you were terrified of what you might find. Caleb squared his shoulders and walked to the stall door, his hand resting on the latch. Whatever secrets his grandfather was about to reveal, whatever dangerous truths that journal contained, he would face them. He owed his father that much. He owed them both that much. Henry's footsteps echoed in the barn doorway, and Caleb took a deep breath, preparing to step into whatever came next. The journal felt heavier than it should have when Henry placed it in Caleb's hands. Bound in cracked leather the color of old blood, it bore the scars of 20 years hidden away, water stains, scratched corners, and a brass clasp that had turned green with age. Thomas Morrison's initials were burned into the cover, in letters that had once been crisp, but now seemed to blur at the edges, as if time itself was trying to erase them. "Your daddy started writing in this the day he got back from Vietnam," Henry said, his voice carefully controlled. "Kept it right up until—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Caleb's fingers traced the worn leather, and he felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening that could never be closed again. This wasn't just a book, it was his father's thoughts, his secrets, his voice reaching across 2 decades of silence. Once Caleb opened it, he would know things about Thomas Morrison that went beyond the heroic stories Henry had always told. He would discover who his father really was, not just who people wanted to remember. "Are you sure about this, Grandad?" The words came out smaller than Caleb intended. "Maybe some things are better left buried." Henry's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I thought so too, son. Spent 20 years thinking so. But that horse," he nodded toward the stallion, who watched them with those impossibly knowing eyes. "Midnight's come home for a reason. Maybe it's time the truth came home too." The stallion nickered softly as if agreeing, and Caleb felt the last of his hesitation crumble away. His hands were steady as he opened the brass clasp and lifted the cover. The first page was dated June 15th, 1967, written in his father's careful script. "Back from the war today. Henry says I should write things down, work through whatever demons followed me home. Don't know if words on paper can fix what's broken inside a man, but reckon it can't hurt to try. He was different when he came back," Henry said quietly. "Still my son, but harder somehow, like he'd seen things that changed the way he looked at the world." Caleb turned pages, scanning entries that spoke of nightmares and guilt, of trying to find peace in ranch work and failing. But gradually the tone shifted. There were entries about gentling wild horses, about finding purpose in healing broken things, and then, on a page dated September 3rd, 1967, everything changed. "Found him today up in Palo Duro Canyon. Black stallion, maybe 4 years old, wild as a hurricane and twice as beautiful. Someone's been after him. Rope burns on his neck, whip marks on his flanks. Took me 3 hours just to get close enough to touch him. Henry thinks I'm crazy, but there's something about this horse, something that understands what it means to be hurt and scared and still keep fighting. Going to call him Midnight. Figure we can heal together." "That's when your daddy started coming back to himself," Henry murmured. "That horse saved him in ways I never could." The entries that followed painted a picture of man and stallion learning to trust again, finding in each other what the war had stolen from them both. Thomas wrote about long rides across the ranch, about Midnight's intelligence and loyalty, about feeling whole for the first time since coming home. But then the tone shifted again, darker this time. Entries from 1986 spoke of strangers asking questions around town, of cattle found dead with no explanation, of Henry receiving threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. "Someone's been watching the ranch. Saw fresh tire tracks down by the south gate, and Jim Hartley says a man in an expensive suit was asking about me in town yesterday, asking about the war, about things that should be buried and forgotten. Starting to think my past caught up with me. If something happens, I want it known that Henry had nothing to do with any of it. This is my burden, my debt coming due." Caleb's blood turned to ice water as he read the final entries. His father had known he was in danger, had known someone was coming for him. The fire hadn't been an accident, it had been murder. "If they want me dead, so be it. But they won't get Midnight. Already made arrangements with a man up in Oklahoma, someone who can keep him safe until the danger passes. Won't risk that horse for anything, not after everything we've been through together." The journal trembled in Caleb's hands as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. His father had sent Midnight away before the fire, had saved the stallion's life by sacrificing their time together. But somehow, 20 years later, the horse had found his way back to the Morrison Ranch, back to the place where he belonged, back to the son of the man who'd loved him enough to let him go. Caleb looked up at his grandfather through eyes blurred with tears, and saw his own realization reflected in Henry's weathered face. They weren't just dealing with a mysterious horse anymore. They were standing at the edge of a conspiracy that had murdered his father, and might still be out there, waiting. There was no going back now. The truth had been set loose, and it would demand its price whether they were ready to pay it or not. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Caleb clutched his father's journal against his chest while Midnight shifted restlessly in his stall, as if the horse could sense the electricity in the air, the moment when everything familiar becomes dangerous. "Granddad," Caleb's voice cracked on the word. "Who killed my father?" Henry's face had aged a decade in the span of minutes. He leaned heavily against the stall door, his weathered hands gripping the rails so tight his knuckles went white. "I don't know, son. Your daddy never told me the details. Just said there were things from the war that followed him home. Things he couldn't outrun forever." "But you suspected," Caleb pressed. "All these years, you knew it wasn't an accident." The old man's shoulders sagged under the weight of 20 years of lies. "I knew. God help me. I knew, and I did nothing about it. Told myself it was better to let sleeping dogs lie, better to protect what was left of our family than go chasing ghosts." His voice turned bitter. "Coward's way out. Caleb felt something cold and hard settling in his stomach. If his grandfather had known the truth and chosen to hide it, what else might Henry be hiding? The foundation of trust he'd built his whole world on suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. Who else knows? Caleb asked. Nobody. Leastways, nobody who'd admit to knowing. Henry straightened up, and Caleb caught a glimpse of the steel that had kept the Morrison ranch running through decades of drought and hardship. But if these people killed your daddy once, they won't hesitate to finish the job if they think we're getting too close to the truth. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. They won't hesitate to finish the job. The danger wasn't some abstract thing from the past. It was real, immediate, and it had teeth. He was 8 years old, and somewhere out there were people who'd murdered his father and might come for him next. Midnight whinnied softly, and Caleb turned to find the stallion watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. The horse stepped closer, pressing his muzzle against Caleb's shoulder in what felt like comfort. Or maybe solidarity. Two survivors of the same tragedy, bound together by loss and secrets. "We have to tell someone," Caleb said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. The sheriff, the FBI, somebody. Henry shook his head slowly. "Tell them what? That a horse came back from the dead? That we think your daddy was murdered, but we can't prove it and don't know who did it?" His laugh was sharp as broken glass. "They'd either think we're crazy or they'd start asking questions that might get us both killed." The truth of it settled over Caleb like a suffocating blanket. They were alone in this. Just an old man and a boy and a horse that shouldn't exist. No cavalry was coming, no adults who could take this burden off his shoulders and make everything safe again. But then he thought about the journal in his hands, about the man who'd written those careful words while knowing he was probably going to die. His father hadn't given up. Even facing killers in the dark, Thomas Morrison had found a way to save what mattered most to him. He'd sent Midnight away, kept a record of the truth, and made sure both would survive to fight another day. "The man in Oklahoma," Caleb said suddenly. "The one Daddy sent Midnight to. He might know something." Henry's eyes sharpened. "Could be. If he's still alive, if we can find him, if he's willing to talk." He paused, studying his grandson's face. "But that's a lot of ifs, son. And traveling that road means accepting that our lives just got a whole lot more dangerous." Caleb looked down at the journal, then back at Midnight. The stallion had survived 20 years of exile, had somehow found his way back across hundreds of miles to the place where he belonged. If a horse could show that kind of loyalty and determination, what excuse did a Morrison have for doing less? "I'm not going to let them win," Caleb said, and was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "They took my father away from me before I ever got to know him. They're not taking anything else." Henry studied his grandson for a long moment, and Caleb saw something shift in the old man's expression, a recognition maybe of the steel that ran in Morrison blood. When Henry spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Then we'd better start figuring out who we can trust," he said. "Because if we're really going to do this, we're going to need allies. And we're going to need to be very, very careful about who we let get close." As if summoned by his words, the sound of an approaching truck engine drifted across the morning air. Someone was coming up their drive, and in this new world they'd stepped into, where horses returned from the dead and old murders cast long shadows, every unexpected visitor had become a potential threat. Caleb's blood turned to ice as the truck engine grew louder. Henry was already moving, crossing to the barn's side window with the fluid motion of a man who'd spent 20 years expecting the worst. His grandfather's transformation was startling. Gone was the weary rancher, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. "Get Midnight to the back stall," Henry whispered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Keep him quiet. If this goes sideways, you take that horse and you run. I'm not leaving you. You'll do what I tell you." Henry's eyes never left the window as he tracked the approaching vehicle. "Your daddy died to keep you safe, boy. I won't dishonor that sacrifice by getting you killed on my watch." Caleb's hands shook as he grabbed Midnight's lead rope. The stallion seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, following without resistance as they moved deeper into the barn's shadows. Through gaps in the weathered boards, Caleb could see dust rising from the dirt road, still too far to make out the vehicle, but close enough to feel the weight of approaching danger. The journal felt like it was burning against his chest where he'd pressed it inside his shirt. 20 years of secrets, 20 years of lies, and now someone was coming up their drive at the exact moment they'd uncovered the truth. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered to Midnight, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to calm the horse or himself. His whole body was vibrating with nervous energy, every instinct screaming at him to run. But where could they go? This ranch was the only home he'd ever known, and Henry was the only family he had left. The engine sound changed as the vehicle turned into their yard, gravel crunching under heavy tires. Through the barn's front window, Caleb caught a glimpse of chrome and dark paint. Not a ranch truck, not something that belonged in their world of dust and honest work. Henry had positioned himself behind a support beam, and Caleb was shocked to see his grandfather holding an old Winchester rifle. When had Henry gotten the gun? How had Caleb missed him retrieving it? "Stay down," Henry mouthed. And Caleb pressed himself against the back wall of the stall, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it could be heard across the yard. The truck engine shut off, and in the sudden silence, every sound seemed magnified. A door slamming, footsteps on gravel, the creak of their front porch, steps under unfamiliar weight. Midnight's ears were pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for scents that might spell danger. The stallion's tension was infectious, and Caleb found himself holding his breath as voices drifted across the yard, Henry's carefully neutral greeting, and another voice, smoother, more cultured than the rough drawl of local ranchers. "Morning, Mr. Morrison. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The stranger's tone was polite, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made Caleb's skin crawl. It was the voice of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, one way or another. "Just morning chores," Henry replied, and Caleb could hear the wariness his grandfather was trying to hide. "What can I do for you? I represent some associates with an interest in your property. We understand you've been having some financial difficulties." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. The bank, the foreclosure threats. In all the shock of discovering the truth about his father, he'd almost forgotten about their more immediate crisis. But now those two disasters were colliding, creating a perfect storm that threatened to destroy everything they had left. "Ranch isn't for sale," Henry said flatly. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Morrison. It's just a matter of finding the right price." A pause, heavy with implication. Or the right motivation. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. They were being threatened. Not just financially, but physically. He could hear it in the stranger's carefully chosen words, in the way Henry's breathing had changed. Through the barn wall, Caleb could make out the murmur of continued conversation, but the specific words were lost. What he could hear clearly was the change in tone. Henry's voice growing harder, more defiant, while the stranger's maintained its veneer of politeness over something much darker. Midnight shifted restlessly, and Caleb placed a calming hand on the stallion's neck. The horse's muscles were coiled like springs, ready for fight or flight. Caleb wondered if Midnight remembered other threats, other dangerous men who'd come calling 20 years ago. A new sound made Caleb's blood freeze. More vehicles approaching. The stranger hadn't come alone, he'd brought backup. Whatever was happening out there, it was bigger than a simple business proposition. Caleb clutched his father's journal tighter and made a silent promise to the memory of Thomas Morrison. Whatever these people wanted, whatever they were willing to do to get it, they wouldn't win. Not this time. But as more engines shut off in their yard and more doors slammed, Caleb realized that making such promises and keeping them were two very different things. The sound of heavy boots on gravel multiplied, and Caleb's mouth went dry as desert sand. 3 trucks, maybe 4. Too many for a friendly business call, too many for anything good. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows of Midnight's stall, The stallion's warm flank against his shoulder, the only solid thing in a world suddenly turned liquid with fear. "Quite a welcoming committee you've brought." Henry's voice carried across the yard, steady as bedrock, despite the odds stacking against him. "Insurance," the smooth-voiced stranger replied. "Sometimes old ranchers can be stubborn about change. We find it helps to make our intentions clear from the start." Through a gap in the barn boards, Caleb caught glimpses of movement, men spreading out across their yard with the practiced efficiency of a military operation. These weren't bankers or real estate agents. These were professionals, the kind of people who solved problems that couldn't be handled with paperwork and legal threats. The journal pressed against his ribs felt like it was burning through his shirt. His father had written about men like these, about expensive suits and veiled threats, about a past that wouldn't stay buried. Now that past had come calling with compound interest, and Caleb was 8 years old and hiding in a barn while his grandfather faced down killers alone. "Let's cut through the pleasantries, Morrison." The stranger's voice had shed its false warmth like a snake shedding skin. "We know you've been asking questions. We know you've got something that doesn't belong to you. This can go easy or hard. Your choice." Caleb's blood turned to ice water. They knew. Somehow they knew about the journal, about midnight, about everything. But how? They'd only discovered the truth themselves an hour ago. Unless the realization hit him like a physical blow. They'd been watching, all this time, through all the years of Henry's careful silence. Someone had been keeping tabs on the Morrison ranch, waiting, watching for any sign that the past might resurface. Midnight's ears flattened against his skull, and the stallion's muscles bunched like coiled springs. The horse remembered these men, or men like them. 20 years couldn't erase the memory of betrayal and violence, of flames consuming everything he'd loved. "I don't know what you're talking about," Henry said. But his voice had taken on a tight, careful quality that made Caleb's heart race. "The horse, old man." The stranger's words dropped into the morning air like stones into still water. Black stallion with a white star, branded with a TM on his left shoulder. Sound familiar? Caleb's world tilted sideways. They knew about midnight, knew about the brand, knew everything. Which meant they'd been looking for the stallion all these years, searching for the one piece of evidence that could unravel whatever conspiracy had killed his father. "My son's horse died 20 years ago," Henry said. "Burned in a fire, along with my boy." "Did it?" The stranger's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Funny thing about death, Morrison. Sometimes it doesn't take the first time." Through the barn wall, Caleb could hear movement, boots on wooden steps, men positioning themselves around the house. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to finish what they'd started 2 decades ago, to eliminate the last loose ends that threatened their carefully constructed lie. Henry was outnumbered, outgunned, and growing older by the minute. But he was still a Morrison, still had that stubborn streak of steel that had kept their family ranch running through dust bowls, and recessions, and every other disaster Texas could throw at them. "Whatever you think you're going to find here," Henry said, "you're wasting your time. There's nothing left of my son's life except memories and regret. We'll be the judge of that." The stranger's voice was moving closer to the house. "Boys, tear this place apart. Start with the barn." Caleb's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. They were coming. In minutes, maybe seconds, armed men would come through that barn door, and there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The back stall offered concealment but not escape, and midnight was too big, too distinctive to miss. The stallion seemed to sense his panic, turning to press his muzzle against Caleb's cheek in what felt like goodbye. Those dark eyes held depths of understanding no animal should possess, and in them Caleb saw his own fear reflected back at him. But he also saw something else, determination, the same quality that had driven his father to save this horse 20 years ago, the same stubborn courage that kept Henry standing on that porch facing impossible odds. Caleb Morrison was 8 years old, terrified, and probably about to die, but he was also Thomas Morrison's son, and some things were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed hopeless. His father had died protecting the truth. Henry was risking everything to honor that sacrifice. Now it was Caleb's turn to prove what Morrison blood was worth. The barn door exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from the rafters, and everything Caleb thought he knew about his quiet ranch life disappeared forever. 3 armed men burst through the splintered barn door, their weapons sweeping the shadows like deadly searchlights. Caleb pressed himself against the back wall of Midnight's stall, his heart hammering so violently he was certain they'd hear it echoing off the rafters. The journal crinkled against his chest as he tried to make himself smaller, invisible, anything but the terrified boy who held the key to 20 years of buried secrets. "Check every stall," the lead man barked, his voice sharp as broken glass. "If that horse is here, I want him found. And if anyone's hiding with him—" He didn't need to finish the threat. The implications hung in the dusty air like smoke, choking off Caleb's breath. These weren't the kind of men who left witnesses. Midnight stood frozen beside him, every muscle coiled tight as a spring. The stallion's nostrils flared as he tested the air, reading the scent of danger that rolled off the intruders in waves. 20 years ago, men like these had destroyed his world in flames. Now they were back to finish what they'd started. Boots thundered across the barn floor, systematic and methodical. First stall, empty. Second stall, nothing but old hay and rusted tools. They were working their way back, and Caleb counted the seconds until discovery like a condemned man counting heartbeats. Through the barn walls he could hear more destruction. Glass breaking in the house. Furniture overturning. Henry shouting in protest before his voice was cut short by a sound that made Caleb's stomach clench with terror. His grandfather, the only family he had left, the man who'd raised him and protected him, was in the hands of killers. "Found something!" The shout came from near the front of the barn, and for one wild moment, Caleb hoped they'd discovered some meaningless artifact that would satisfy their search. But then he heard the scraping of wood against wood, the creak of old hinges, and his heart sank like a stone. Well, well, look what we have here. They'd found his father's hiding place. The loose board where Thomas Morrison had concealed evidence, photographs, anything that might prove what really happened that night 20 years ago. Caleb had missed it in his earlier exploration, but these men had come prepared. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "Boss is going to want to see this," another voice said, and Caleb heard papers rustling. "Looks like the old man's been busy." The search resumed with renewed intensity. 4th stall, 5th. They were 2 stalls away now, and Midnight's ears were pinned flat against his skull. The stallion could smell their approach, could taste the violence that clung to them like a second skin. Caleb's mind raced through impossible options. The back door, too far, too exposed. The loft, a trap with no escape. Fighting was suicide for an 8-year-old boy against armed men. But running meant abandoning Henry, meant letting these killers destroy the last remnants of his family. The sound of splintering wood echoed from the house, followed by a crash that shook the barn walls. They were tearing the Morrison home apart piece by piece, erasing decades of memories with the systematic thoroughness of termites. 6th stalls clear, came the call, and Caleb's time ran out like sand through an hourglass. 1 stall left. Theirs. Midnight turned to look at him one final time, and in those dark eyes Caleb saw an apology. Or maybe a promise. The stallion had survived 20 years of exile, had somehow found his way home across impossible distances, only to face the same enemies that had destroyed his first life. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. Heavy boots stopped outside their stall. Caleb could see shadows moving beyond the wooden slats, could hear the metallic click of a weapon being readied. His father's journal felt like it was burning against his chest, 20 years of secrets about to die with him in this dusty barn where he'd spent the happiest moments of his short life. "Well, well," a voice said, dripping with satisfaction. "What do we have here?" The stall door swung open, and afternoon sunlight poured in like the wrath of God. Silhouetted against the brightness stood a figure in an expensive suit, incongruous in this world of hay and honest sweat. Behind him, 2 more men with weapons drawn and faces hard as granite. Caleb looked up at them. This 8-year-old boy who'd stumbled onto a conspiracy that had killed his father and was about to claim him too. He thought about Henry, probably dying in the house. About his mother, who'd never know what really happened to her family. About all the plans he'd made for the future that would never come. But mostly he thought about the man who'd written the journal pressed against his heart, Thomas Morrison, who'd faced these same killers 20 years ago and found the courage to save what mattered most. The lead man stepped into the stall, gun raised, and smiled like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Got you." The gun barrel gleamed dull silver in the dusty light, and Caleb Morrison stared death in the face with the peculiar clarity that comes to children in moments of absolute terror. Time stretched like taffy, and in that suspended heartbeat before violence, everything changed. Midnight exploded into motion. 20 years of rage, 20 years of betrayal and loss, and enforced silence erupted from the black stallion, like a force of nature unleashed. The horse that had stood docile through rescue and recovery became something primal and terrible, rearing up on hind legs with a scream that shattered the air like breaking glass. The gunman stumbled backward, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the rafters, as 1,200 pounds of fury crashed down where he'd been standing. Splinters rained from above as Midnight pivoted with impossible grace, his hooves striking out at the other men crowding the stall door. "Jesus Christ!" one of them shouted, diving sideways as iron-shod death whistled past his head. "It's like the damn thing knows—" The words died as understanding flickered across the man's face. Recognition. The same recognition Caleb had felt when he'd first looked into Midnight's eyes and seen impossible intelligence staring back. Because it wasn't just any horse protecting him. This was Thomas Morrison's stallion, risen from the dead with all the fury of the grave, and these men had killed his master. Caleb pressed himself against the stall wall, his mind reeling as fragments of truth crashed together like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. The journal entries that described Midnight's uncanny intelligence, the way the horse had known exactly where to go, what to show him, the bond that transcended death itself. "Shoot it!" the lead gunman screamed, scrambling for his dropped weapon. "Shoot the damn thing!" But Midnight was already moving, driving forward with the inexorable force of justice too long delayed. His teeth found the nearest man's shoulder, and the scream that followed was hardly human. The stallion shook his victim like a terrier with a rat before hurling him aside and wheeling to face the others. In that moment of chaos, Caleb saw his chance. Not to escape, there was nowhere to run, but to understand. His hands shaking, he pulled the journal from his shirt and flipped desperately through pages he'd memorized, searching for the entry that had haunted him. July 15th, 1967. Midnight saved my life today. Not just from the rattler, from myself. Sometimes I think that horse knows things no animal should know, like he can see straight through to a man's soul. July 30th, 1967. Found Midnight standing over Sarah's grave again. He's been doing that every night since the funeral. It's like he's keeping watch, like he knows she's not really gone. Makes a man wonder about the nature of love and loyalty. August 12th, 1967. Dr. Peterson laughs when I tell him about Midnight's strange behavior, but I've seen things. The horse led me to the injured calf in the north pasture. No way he should have known it was there. Found me when I was lost in that storm last winter, appeared out of nowhere like he'd been called. There's something different about that stallion. The pages blurred through Caleb's tears, but his fingers found the entry that changed everything. September 3rd, 1967. Had the strangest conversation with old Pete today. He was telling stories about his grandfather's horses, the ones that came back from the dead to protect their families. Said love like that doesn't die with the body, that some bonds run deeper than flesh and bone. Looked at Midnight when he said it, and I swear that horse understood every word. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The truth wasn't just about the brand or the scars or the impossible survival. It was about something far more profound, far more impossible. Midnight wasn't just his father's horse. Midnight was his father. The revelation hit him like lightning, illuminating everything in stark, impossible clarity. The protective instincts, the way the horse had known exactly where to find evidence, exactly how to comfort a grieving boy. The intelligence that went beyond animal cunning into something achingly, recognizably human. Thomas Morrison had died protecting his son's future, but love like that didn't end with death. It found a way to return, to keep fighting, to ensure that justice would finally be served. Gunfire erupted around him, but Caleb barely heard it. His father was here. His father had never left him. Through 20 years of exile and pain, through impossible distances and unimaginable hardship, love had found a way to come home. The black stallion, his father, turned to look at him one final time, and in those dark eyes Caleb saw everything he'd lost reflected back: protection, sacrifice, and a love that conquered death itself. "I know," Caleb whispered through his tears. "I know who you are." And Thomas Morrison, wearing the body of the horse he'd loved in life, turned back to face the men who had destroyed their family, with the fury of a father protecting his child. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of Caleb's ragged breathing and the soft nickering of the stallion who was his father. Smoke hung in the dusty air like morning fog, and 3 men lay motionless on the barn floor, not dead, but broken in ways that would take months to heal. Thomas Morrison, in the body of Midnight, stood over them with the satisfied air of justice finally served. His dark coat gleamed with sweat, but his breathing was steady, controlled. He'd fought like the avenging spirit he was, but now the immediate threat was neutralized. Caleb pushed himself away from the wall on trembling legs, the journal clutched against his chest like a talisman. The impossible truth sang in his blood, wild and terrifying and somehow perfectly right. His father hadn't abandoned him. Through 20 years of seeming death, through transformations that defied everything he'd been taught about the world, love had endured. "Dad," he whispered, and the stallion's ears swiveled toward him with heartbreaking recognition. But there was no time for reunion. Shouts echoed from the house, more men, more weapons, and Henry still in mortal danger. The fight in the barn had been won, but the war was far from over. Midnight moved to the fallen gunmen with deliberate precision, using his hooves to scatter their weapons beyond reach. The lead man groaned and tried to sit up, only to find himself staring into eyes that held far too much intelligence for any normal horse. He fell back with a whimper of terror. "What the hell are you?" he gasped. Caleb felt strength flowing back into his limbs, borrowed from his father's unbreakable spirit. "He's justice," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Something you should have faced 20 years ago." The man's face went white as understanding dawned. "Morrison. You're Thomas Morrison." Midnight's response was to place one iron-shod hoof inches from the man's throat, close enough to make the threat clear, controlled enough to show the restraint that separated justice from murder. Caleb's mind raced with newfound clarity. The immediate danger was contained, but more men surrounded the house. Henry needed help, and they needed evidence that would expose the conspiracy once and for all. The journal was damning, but it was still just one man's word against whatever organization had the resources to mount an operation like this. "We need proof," Caleb said to Midnight, and the stallion's nod was achingly human, something they can't deny or destroy. His father in horse form moved to one of the fallen men, the one who'd been carrying a radio. With careful precision, Midnight used his teeth to activate the device, and suddenly the barn filled with crackling voices. "Secure the perimeter. Old man's not talking. Find those documents before." And then, clear as a bell, the voice that made Caleb's blood run cold. "This is control. If you can't find what we need in the next 5 minutes, burn it all. House, barn, everything. Make it look like an accident, just like before." The radio fell silent, but those words hung in the air like a confession. Burn it all, just like before. Here was the proof they needed. Admission that the fire 20 years ago had been arson, that Thomas Morrison's death had been murder. Caleb fumbled in his pocket for the small tape recorder he'd brought to interview Henry about ranch history. His fingers shook as he rewound the device, praying it had caught the transmission. The voices played back tinny but clear, evidence that would destroy the conspiracy that had stolen his family. Midnight moved to the barn's back door, his meaning unmistakable. They had what they needed, but staying meant dying in flames just as Thomas Morrison had died 20 years before. The cycle would repeat unless they found a way to break it. But Caleb couldn't leave, not with Henry still in the house, still in the hands of killers. His grandfather had risked everything to keep the family secrets, to raise an orphaned boy and maintain hope that someday justice would come home. "I won't leave him," Caleb said, and saw approval in his father's dark eyes. "We don't abandon family." Midnight's response was to move toward the front of the barn, toward the house where violence waited. But this time they wouldn't face it alone. This time they had each other, father and son reunited across the impossible gulf of death, armed with truth and driven by love that had conquered the grave itself. Caleb tucked the journal and recorder into his shirt and climbed onto Midnight's back. The stallion's strength flowed through him, 20 years of exile and pain transformed into unbreakable resolve. They would save Henry. They would expose the conspiracy. They would finish what Thomas Morrison had started in life and continued in death. The Morrison family had endured drought and depression, loss and betrayal. They would endure this too, because some bonds were stronger than death, and some truths demanded to be told no matter the cost. Together, father and son rode toward their destiny. Midnight's hooves struck the hard-packed earth between barn and house with the rhythm of a war drum, each step carrying them closer to the confrontation that had been 20 years in the making. Caleb felt his father's power beneath him. The stallion's muscles coiled and ready, but also sensed something else, a trembling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the magnitude of what they were about to face. The house loomed before them, every window blazing with artificial light as armed men methodically destroyed decades of Morrison family history. Through the kitchen window, Caleb caught a glimpse of overturned furniture, scattered papers, and Henry tied to a chair with blood trickling from his temple. His grandfather's defiant eyes met his for one electric moment across the distance, and Caleb saw recognition there, not surprise, but the deep satisfaction of a man whose faith had finally been vindicated. Henry had known. Somehow the old rancher had suspected the truth about Midnight, about the impossible return of his beloved son, and had kept that secret as carefully as all the others. 3 men in the house, Caleb whispered, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. At least 2 more outside. Midnight's ear flicked back in acknowledgement, and Caleb felt the stallion's tactical mind working through possibilities. This wasn't just an enraged animal seeking vengeance. This was Thomas Morrison, trained soldier and natural strategist, using every skill he'd acquired in life to protect what mattered most. The front porch steps groaned under Midnight's weight as they approached the door. Inside, voices rose in frustration as the systematic search yielded nothing but family photographs and mortgage papers. The real evidence, the journal and tape recording, remained safe against Caleb's chest, but for how much longer? "Burn it," came the order from inside, sharp with professional impatience. "Boss wants this finished before dawn." The words triggered something primal in Midnight, a rage so pure and focused it made the stallion's earlier fury seem like a gentle breeze. Thomas Morrison had died in flames 20 years ago, watching his life's work turn to ash while assassins ensured no evidence would survive. They would not repeat that horror while his son still drew breath. Midnight reared up and drove his hooves through the front door with explosive force. Wood splintered like matchsticks, and the men inside spun toward the sound with weapons raised, only to freeze in disbelief at the sight of horse and rider framed in the destroyed doorway like some vision from a fever dream. "What the hell?" one of them began, but Midnight was already in motion. The stallion flowed through the house like black lightning, his bulk impossible to stop in the narrow hallways. Furniture scattered like leaves as he wheeled and struck, his hooves finding their targets with surgical precision. These men had training and weapons, but they'd never faced an adversary who knew every inch of this house, who had loved these rooms when they were filled with laughter instead of violence. Caleb clung to his father's back, no longer a helpless child but a warrior's son riding into battle. The tape recorder pressed against his ribs reminded him of their true purpose. Not revenge, but justice. Not just victory, but proof that would ensure this conspiracy could never rise again. "The radio!" he shouted over the chaos, pointing to the communications equipment one gunman had dropped. "We need their transmission logs." Midnight understood immediately, using his bulk to pin the nearest attacker against the wall while Caleb slipped from his back to grab the radio. His small fingers worked frantically through the device's controls, finding the record function just as panicked voices crackled through the speaker. "Control, we have a situation. How many hostiles?" "It's not hostiles, it's some kind of... I don't know what the hell it is. A horse. But it's moving like it knows exactly what it's doing. That's impossible. Tell that to Martinez. Thing broke his arm in 3 places." Caleb's thumb found the record button as the most damning words yet spilled through the static. "Control, this is Field Leader. Operation Cleanup is compromised. Request immediate extraction and cleanup Protocol 7. Repeat, we need the fire team here now, just like the Morrison job in '67. The Morrison job. There it was. Admission of murder, conspiracy, and cover-up. Recorded on equipment they'd brought themselves. Even if Caleb and Henry didn't survive the night, this evidence would eventually surface, would bring down whoever had orchestrated his father's death. But they were going to survive. Caleb could feel that certainty in Midnight's steady heartbeat, in the controlled fury that had transformed his father from victim to avenger. The 8-year-old boy who'd begged to save a broken horse from a kill pen was gone, replaced by Thomas Morrison's son in truth as well as blood. Someone who understood that some fights were worth any cost. Midnight turned toward Henry, still bound and bleeding but alive, his eyes shining with tears and pride. The final confrontation loomed, but they faced it together, 3 generations of Morrisons united by love that transcended death itself. The road back had led them here, to this moment of reckoning. Now they would finish what 20 years of exile had begun. The recording device clicked off with a finality that seemed to echo through the ransacked house. Caleb tucked it deeper into his shirt, next to his father's journal and his own thundering heart. 3 pieces of evidence that would topple an empire built on murder and lies, if they lived long enough to deliver them. Midnight moved with liquid grace to Henry's chair, using his teeth to snap the ropes with surgical precision. The old rancher's hands shook as circulation returned, but his eyes burned with the fierce pride of a man who'd waited 20 years to see his son come home. "I knew," Henry whispered, his weathered fingers reaching up to touch Midnight's muzzle. "From that first day in the kill pen, I knew you'd found your way back to us." The stallion's response was achingly gentle, a soft nicker that carried all the love and regret of a son who'd been forced to watch his father grieve from impossible distance. But there was no time for reunion. Outside, engines roared to life as the extraction team prepared their final gambit. "They're going to burn us out," Caleb said, helping Henry to his feet. The old man leaned heavily against him, 20 years of carrying family secrets having taken their toll. Just like before. "Not this time." Henry's voice carried the iron strength that had built the Morrison Ranch from nothing but dreams and determination. "This time, we're ready." Midnight's ears swiveled toward the back of the house, where the smell of gasoline was beginning to permeate the night air. The extraction team was working with military efficiency, surrounding the house with accelerant, while their remaining men inside stayed down, nursing wounds that would remind them for years to come that some forces couldn't be measured by conventional weapons. But Thomas Morrison hadn't spent 20 years in exile just to watch his family burn twice. Through Midnight's senses he could taste the wind direction, feel the thermal currents that would carry flames. The tactical mind that had once served his country now served a higher purpose, protecting the son and father he'd been torn from by treachery. "The storm cellar," Henry breathed, understanding passing between the 3 generations like electricity. Your father always said if the worst happened. Caleb felt the memory surface, not his own, but inherited through blood and love from the stallion who was his father. Hidden beneath the kitchen floor lay not just shelter from tornadoes, but a cache of documents Thomas Morrison had prepared for exactly this eventuality. Evidence of the conspiracy that reached far beyond one family's tragedy, insurance against the day when truth would finally have its moment. Midnight moved to the kitchen with purpose, his hooves striking the worn linoleum until they found the hollow sound that marked the hidden entrance. Caleb dropped to his knees, feeling along the floorboards until his fingers found the concealed latch. The panel lifted to reveal narrow steps descending into darkness and salvation. "Hurry," Henry urged, but his grandson was already helping him toward the opening. Outside, voices shouted coordinates as the fire team prepared to turn the Morrison house into a funeral pyre. Midnight hesitated at the cellar entrance, his massive frame too large for the narrow opening. For a heart-stopping moment, Caleb thought they would have to choose between family and evidence, between love and justice. Then the stallion backed away, his meaning unmistakable. "No," Caleb said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "We stay together." But Midnight was already moving toward the front of the house, toward the men who thought they could repeat their 20-year-old crime. The stallion's eyes met Caleb's one final time, and in that gaze the boy saw everything his father had been unable to say: love, pride, and the absolute certainty that some sacrifices were worth making. "He's drawing them off," Henry said, his voice thick with grief and admiration. "Giving us time to reach the evidence." The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as Midnight burst through the front door like an avenging spirit made flesh. Shouts erupted outside, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire and the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth. Thomas Morrison was keeping his final promise, to protect his family no matter the cost. Caleb's feet found the cellar steps as orange light began to flicker through the kitchen windows. The accelerant was catching now, flames racing along predetermined paths with hungry efficiency. But in the hidden chamber below, waterproof containers held decades of carefully gathered proof: photographs, financial records, correspondence that would expose every player in the conspiracy that had murdered Thomas Morrison and stolen his son's birthright. "Everything we need is here," Henry said, his hands moving with surprising steadiness through the cache. "Your father knew this day would come." Above them, the house filled with smoke and flame, while outside a black stallion led killers on a chase they would never forget. The final test had begun in earnest, not just of courage or love, but of whether justice delayed could still be justice served. 3 generations of Morrisons faced their destiny in fire and darkness, armed with truth and bound by love that death itself could not break. The cellar air grew thick with smoke seeping through the floorboards above as flames consumed the Morrison family home for the second time in 20 years. Caleb's hands shook as he helped Henry sort through waterproof containers, each one a testament to his father's methodical preparation for this moment of reckoning. "Financial records from Hartwell Industries," Henry muttered, his voice hoarse from smoke and emotion. "Payments to Sheriff Buckley, to Judge Morrison. No relation to us, just a bought name. Your father documented everything." Outside, gunfire cracked like breaking bones, punctuated by the thunder of hooves and terrified shouts. Midnight was buying them time with his life, leading the killers away from the evidence that would destroy them. Every shot that rang out felt like a knife in Caleb's chest, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. "This one," Caleb whispered, pulling out a manila envelope marked with his father's careful handwriting. Inside were photographs, men in expensive suits shaking hands with local officials, meetings that should never have been documented, but were, by a soldier who understood the value of insurance. The heat above grew intense enough to make the cellar air shimmer. Soon the floor would collapse, trapping them in what was meant to be their salvation. But they needed more time to gather everything, time to ensure the evidence would survive, even if they didn't. Then the shooting stopped. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant rumble of thunder from the storm that had been building all evening. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs where the tape recorder pressed, wondering if that terrible quiet meant victory or tragedy. Heavy footsteps echoed above, moving with predatory confidence through the burning house. Someone was coming, someone who'd either killed or captured the stallion that was his father. Caleb felt Henry's weathered hand close over his own, offering what comfort he could as death approached through smoke and flame. Morrison. The voice that boomed down through the cellar opening was cultured, educated, the kind that belonged in boardrooms rather than barns. "Thomas Morrison, I know you can hear me." Caleb's blood turned to ice. They thought Midnight was his father, not reborn or returned, but somehow the same man who'd threatened their conspiracy 20 years ago. The truth was more impossible than their lies, but their misunderstanding might be the key to survival. 20 years I've wondered if we got you all," the voice continued, closer now, standing directly over the hidden entrance. "Should have known a Morrison would be too stubborn to stay dead. But it ends tonight. You, your boy, your father, all of it." Light blazed down as the cellar entrance was yanked open. Caleb squinted up through the smoke to see a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, his face bearing the kind of cold authority that came from decades of orchestrating other people's suffering. Behind him, the Morrison house burned like a vision of hell, 20 years of memories turning to ash and ember. "Harrison Hartwell," Henry breathed, and Caleb felt the name hit him like a physical blow. The man whose signature was on half the documents in these containers, whose money had bought judges and sheriffs, whose orders had killed Thomas Morrison and stolen his family's future. "Hello, Henry," Hartwell said, his tone conversational despite the gun in his hand. "Feeling nostalgic? History does have a way of repeating itself." But even as the oil baron spoke, Caleb heard something else, the distant sound of sirens. Someone had seen the fire, called for help. The cavalry was coming, but would they arrive in time, and whose side would they take when so many officials were already bought and paid for? "You're finished, Harrison," Henry said, struggling to his feet with fierce dignity. "The boys got recordings. Evidence you can't suppress this time." Hartwell's laugh was like breaking glass. "Evidence? In this inferno? Amazing how thoroughly fires can destroy things. Documents, recordings, witnesses. Lightning strike, they'll say. Tragic accident. Just like your son." The confession hung in the smoke-filled air like a physical presence. Even now, thinking himself moments from victory, Hartwell couldn't resist the pride of a master manipulator explaining his work. But he'd made one crucial mistake, the same arrogance that had led him to have his men use their own radio equipment to coordinate the operation. Above the crackle of flames and approaching sirens, a new sound emerged, hoofbeats, moving with purpose through the burning night. Hartwell spun toward the noise, his composure cracking as understanding dawned. The black stallion wasn't dead or captured, he was hunting. Midnight appeared in the cellar entrance like an avenging angel, his dark coat gleaming with sweat and determination, his eyes fixed on the man who'd ordered his murder. Hartwell raised his gun, but the stallion was already in motion, 20 years of exile and rage compressed into one perfect moment of justice. The confrontation that had begun with a father's death and a son's exile was about to end where it started, with the Morrison family standing together against those who'd tried to destroy them. The gun cracked like thunder, but Midnight had already moved, 20 years of supernatural patience erupting into perfect violence. Hartwell's shot went wide as 1,500 pounds of fury drove him backward, his expensive suit no armor against hooves that had carried a father's love across the boundary of death itself. Caleb scrambled up from the cellar as Midnight pinned Hartwell against the burning wall, the stallion's eyes reflecting flames that seemed to burn from within. This was justice distilled to its essence, not the cold calculation of courts, but the raw truth of a father protecting his child. "Please," Hartwell gasped, his authority crumbling like ash. "I can pay you, whatever you want." Midnight's response was a sound no horse should make, something between a scream and a roar that carried 20 years of enforced silence. The stallion reared, and for one crystalline moment Caleb saw not just his father's rage, but his father's breaking heart. Thomas Morrison had loved this land. These people had died believing in justice that never came. The hooves came down. But at the last instant, something shifted in Midnight's eyes. A recognition that vengeance and justice were not the same thing. The killing blow became restraint, hooves striking the burning wall on either side of Hartwell's head, leaving the oil baron alive but forever marked by how close he'd come to a reckoning 20 years in the making. "The law will handle him now," Henry said, emerging from the cellar with arms full of evidence. "We've got enough here to bury his whole operation." Sirens wailed closer, and Caleb could see flashing lights painting the smoke red and blue. But even as rescue approached, he felt something else building in the air around them, a tension that spoke of choices and consequences, of prices that victory demanded. Midnight turned to face him, and in those dark eyes Caleb saw the truth he'd been dreading since the moment they'd found each other. This borrowed time was ending. The supernatural force that had brought his father back, that had defied death itself for love, was reaching its limit. "No," Caleb whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "We won. We got them. You don't have to go." But the stallion was already changing, the solid flesh beginning to shimmer like heat mirages. 20 years of exile, of fighting to return, had been sustained by purpose: protect the family, expose the truth, ensure justice. With those goals achieved, the unnatural bond that held Thomas Morrison to this world was dissolving. "Dad," Caleb said, the word torn from his 8-year-old heart. "Please, I just found you." Midnight stepped forward, his muzzle touching Caleb's forehead with infinite gentleness. The contact brought one final gift, not just love, but understanding. His father's sacrifice hadn't been dying 20 years ago. It had been living in exile, watching his family suffer while he gathered strength for this moment. The real sacrifice was letting go now, when staying would mean trapping himself between worlds forever. "I have to go, son. But I'm not leaving you. Never again." The words came not as sound, but as certainty, written in the space between heartbeats. Henry's weathered hand settled on Caleb's shoulder as the boy reached out to touch his father one last time, feeling solid warmth that was already beginning to fade. "He's free now," Henry said, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "Free to rest, free to trust us to carry on." Fire trucks roared into the yard as Midnight backed away, his form growing translucent against the burning night. Federal agents emerged from unmarked cars, honest ones, Caleb realized, called by evidence his father had ensured would reach the right hands if this night went wrong. The conspiracy that had killed Thomas Morrison and stolen 20 years from the Morrison family was crumbling in real time. Hartwell's men were surrendering, their radio transmissions already in federal custody. The oil baron himself sat broken against the charred wall, his empire of corruption finally facing the light. But none of that mattered to Caleb as much as the ghostly stallion who was his father, growing fainter with each passing second. "I love you," he whispered. Midnight's response was a nicker that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying all the bedtime stories never told, all the riding lessons never given, all the love that death had tried to steal. Then the black stallion faded into smoke and starlight, leaving only the memory of hoofbeats and the absolute certainty that some bonds could never truly break. Caleb Morrison stood in the ruins of his family's home, surrounded by evidence of justice finally served, and understood the cost of victory. His father was gone again, but this time by choice, not murder. Free at last to rest, trusting his son to build something better from the ashes of the past. The sacrifice was complete. The Morrison family was whole again, even in goodbye. The silence after his father's departure felt different from any quiet Caleb had ever known. Not empty, filled with presence, with the weight of completion. He stood motionless in the flickering light of the burning house, his small hand still extended where Midnight's muzzle had been, feeling the lingering warmth of that final touch. "Caleb." Henry's voice was gentle, understanding. "Son, we need to move back. The fire department needs room to work." Around them, the night erupted into organized chaos. Federal agents were already securing Hartwell, reading rights to a man who'd thought himself above such earthly concerns. EMTs rushed toward them, concerned faces appearing through the smoke. Fire trucks positioned themselves with military precision, their crews attacking the blaze that threatened to consume what remained of the Morrison family home. But Caleb couldn't move. 20 years his father had waited, 20 years of watching from impossible distance, and now he was gone again. The victory felt hollow, incomplete, like winning a game after your best friend had already left the playground. "He's at peace now," Henry said, kneeling beside his grandson despite his own exhaustion. "Your daddy spent 20 years fighting to get home to us. Now he can rest, knowing we're safe." A paramedic approached with practiced efficiency, checking Caleb for smoke inhalation and burns he didn't even realize he had. Small cuts from broken glass, singed eyebrows from the heat, palms scraped raw from crawling through the cellar, evidence of a night that had aged him far beyond his 8 years. "You're going to be fine," the woman said, her voice professionally soothing. "But we should get you to the hospital for observation. Both of you." Caleb nodded absently, his attention drawn to Agent Martinez, who was coordinating with local law enforcement. The man caught his eye and walked over, his expression grave but respectful. "Son, I need you to know what you did tonight, that recording, the evidence your grandfather secured. It's going to put a lot of bad people away for a very long time." Martinez crouched to Caleb's eye level. "Your father would be proud." "He knows," Caleb said simply, and something in his tone made the agent nod without question. The tape recorder was carefully removed from where it had pressed against his ribs, its plastic case warm from his body heat, but miraculously intact. Those voices, those confessions, Hartwell's admission of murder, the casual discussion of burning them out, all of it preserved on magnetic tape that would echo in courtrooms for years to come. Henry watched as federal agents sealed evidence containers, each one a nail in the conspiracy's coffin. 47 years I've been wondering if justice would ever come," he murmured. "Thought I might die not knowing." "Dad made sure you'd know," Caleb replied, remembering the certainty he'd felt in that final moment of contact. "He made sure we'd all know." An ambulance waited to transport them to the hospital, but Caleb found himself reluctant to leave. This place where his father had lived and died, where love had transcended death itself, felt sacred somehow. Even burning, even reduced to ash and memory, it was still home. "The ranch will survive," Henry said, reading his thoughts. "We'll rebuild. Your father left us more than just evidence. He left us the means to start over. Clean slate, clean conscience." Agent Martinez returned with a clipboard full of forms, witness statements that would need to be given, procedures that justice demanded. "We'll need formal interviews tomorrow, but for tonight, get some rest. Both of you have been through enough." As they walked toward the ambulance, Caleb felt something shift in the air. Not supernatural this time, just the natural movement of wind across open prairie. The storm that had been building all evening was finally breaking, fat raindrops beginning to fall on the burning house. Even the weather seemed to understand that the time for fire was ending. "Will you tell me about him?" Caleb asked as they settled into the ambulance. "About what he was like before?" Henry's weathered face softened with memory. "He was a lot like you, actually. Fearless with horses, stubborn as a mule when he thought something was right. He'd have loved watching you stand up to those men tonight." The ambulance pulled away from the ranch, its headlights sweeping across familiar territory that would soon be transformed by truth. No more shadows, no more secrets, no more weight of unspoken grief crushing down on everything the Morrison family tried to build. Behind them, the house continued to burn, but it was a cleansing fire now, destroying the place where lies had festered, clearing ground for something honest to grow. Federal agents worked by floodlight, documenting evidence that would reshape the political landscape of 3 counties. Caleb pressed his face to the ambulance window, watching until the flames disappeared over a hill. Somewhere in that orange glow, he thought he could still sense his father's presence, not the supernatural return that had brought midnight to life, but the eternal kind of presence that lived in love and memory, and the determination to be worthy of both. The immediate danger was over. The conspiracy was crumbling, but the real work, learning to live with victory's weight, was just beginning. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fresh sheets, a stark contrast to the smoke and fear that had defined the past few hours. Caleb sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his legs dangling over the side, watching the pre-dawn darkness through windows that faced east toward home. Somewhere beyond those hills, federal agents were still working by floodlight, cataloguing evidence that would rewrite 20 years of lies. Henry dozed in the chair beside him, finally allowing exhaustion to claim what fear had held at bay. The old man's weathered hands were bandaged now, cuts from broken glass cleaned and dressed, but he'd refused to leave Caleb's side even for the few minutes it took doctors to examine them both. "Can't sleep." Caleb turned to find Dr. Sarah Chen in the doorway, her expression kind but concerned. She'd been the one to treat them, asking gentle questions about smoke inhalation while carefully avoiding the more complicated truths that had brought them here. "Not really," he admitted. "Feels strange, being still." She nodded, understanding more than her words suggested. "The nurse said your grandfather mentioned you lost your parents. I'm sorry. That's a heavy load for someone your age." "My dad came back, though," Caleb said simply. "Long enough to help." Dr. Chen's expression shifted, the careful neutrality medical professionals wore when children said things that couldn't quite be explained, but she didn't dismiss it, didn't correct him. Instead, she checked his chart one final time. "Physically, you're both fine. Some minor cuts, smoke exposure that should clear up in a day or two. The sheriff's department said they'll need to speak with you later, but there's no rush." She paused. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Family?" "We've got each other," Henry said, stirring awake with the practiced alertness of someone who'd learned to sleep light. "Always have." The morning brought visitors Caleb hadn't expected. Agent Martinez arrived first, carrying coffee for Henry and a chocolate milk that somehow appeared exactly when Caleb needed it most. Behind him came Sheriff Williams, not the corrupt official they'd feared, but an honest lawman who'd been kept in the dark about the conspiracy until federal evidence made denial impossible. "Son," Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years' worth of regret, "I need you to know. If I'd had any idea what really happened to your daddy, things would have been different. A lot different." Caleb studied the sheriff's face, seeing genuine remorse alongside determination. "You know now." "Yes, I do. And I give you my word. Everyone involved will answer for what they did. Every last one." Martinez spread photographs across the hospital table, faces of men who'd thought themselves untouchable. "Hartwell's already talking, trying to cut a deal. But with the evidence you provided, he doesn't have much to bargain with." "What about the ranch?" Henry asked. "The bank, the foreclosure?" "Funny thing about that." Martinez smiled. "Seems the bank president was getting pressure from some very specific people to accelerate your loan default. Now that those people are in federal custody, the bank's suddenly much more willing to work with you. Something about discovering irregularities in their own paperwork." Caleb felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the hospital heating, his father's influence reaching beyond death to secure the future he'd died trying to protect. The door opened again, and this time it was Mrs. Patterson from down the road, carrying a bag that smelled of fresh biscuits and homemade jam. Behind her came the Hendersons, the Johnsons, families who'd known Thomas Morrison and had quietly wondered about the official story for 20 years. "Heard what really happened," Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "About time the truth came out. Your daddy was a good man, Henry. A good man." They stayed for an hour, these neighbors who'd become strangers when suspicion and fear drove wedges through the community. But the conspiracy's exposure was healing more than just the Morrison family. It was restoring trust that corruption had slowly poisoned, rebuilding connections that lies had severed. When visiting hours ended and they were finally alone, Caleb found himself thinking not about what they'd lost, but what they'd gained. The ranch would survive now, stronger than before. The family name was cleared, his father's memory restored to the honor it deserved. But more than that, the terrible weight of secrets was finally lifted. "Grandpa?" he said as Henry prepared to leave for a few hours' real sleep. "Are we different now?" Henry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I reckon we are. We've seen things, done things, learned things that change a person. But different doesn't mean damaged, Caleb. Sometimes it means stronger. I feel stronger, Caleb admitted. Like I could handle whatever comes next. Your daddy would be proud to hear that. Proud of the man you're already becoming. As Henry left to arrange their discharge, Caleb sat alone in the quiet room, watching sunlight creep across the Texas hills through windows that no longer seemed like barriers. He was changed by loss, by truth, by the impossible gift of a father's love transcending death itself. Tomorrow, they would go home to rebuild on honest ground. The drive home from the hospital took place in comfortable silence. Henry's old pickup truck rattling over familiar roads that somehow looked different in the clear morning light. Where once shadows had seemed to hide threats, now the Texas landscape stretched open and honest under a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Caleb pressed his face to the passenger window, watching fence posts and cattle gates that no longer carried the weight of secrets. They crested the hill overlooking the ranch, and Caleb's breath caught. The house was gone, reduced to a blackened foundation and scattered debris, but federal agents had worked through the night to secure the property. Yellow tape marked evidence areas, and a temporary command post had been established near the barn. Even in destruction, the land felt reclaimed. "Looks different, doesn't it?" Henry said, following his grandson's gaze. "Clean somehow." Agent Martinez approached as they parked, his expression lighter than it had been the night before. "Morning. Thought you'd want to know. Hartwell's entire organization is rolling over. We've got arrests happening in 3 states. This thing goes deeper than we imagined, but it's finished now." Caleb nodded, feeling a strange sense of completion. His father's 20-year fight was truly over. "There's something else," Martinez continued, producing a manila envelope. "Legal documents we found in Hartwell's safe. Seems he'd been planning to buy your ranch all along, had papers drawn up, bribes documented. But there's also this." He handed Henry a deed, the original deed to Morrison land, the one that had mysteriously disappeared from county records decades ago. Your mineral rights, your water rights, everything, all documented, all legal. You're not just keeping this ranch. You're sitting on one of the richest aquifers in West Texas. Henry's weathered hands trembled as he examined the papers. Thomas knew. Somehow, he knew what they were really after. The next few hours passed in a blur of official business and practical concerns. Insurance adjusters, investigators, well-wishers from town who'd heard the news. Mrs. Patterson returned with enough food to feed half the county, and the Henderson boys volunteered to help with temporary housing arrangements. But as afternoon settled into evening and the officials departed, Caleb found himself drawn to the barn where this impossible journey had begun. The building stood untouched by fire, its weathered walls holding memories of the skeletal black horse he'd insisted on rescuing from the kill pen. Inside, the stall where midnight had recovered still smelled of fresh hay and horse liniment. Caleb ran his fingers along the wooden boards, remembering how his father, wearing the shape of a dying stallion, had slowly returned to strength within these walls. "He's really gone, isn't he?" Caleb said when Henry joined him. "The horse, yes. The spirit that was your daddy, yes." Henry leaned against the stall door. "But what he left us, that's still here, always will be." On the workbench, Thomas Morrison's journal lay open to the page where this all began. Sketches of a black stallion, notes about strange dreams, warnings about men who would stop at nothing to claim what wasn't theirs. But now there were new pages, filled with Caleb's own handwriting, documenting the impossible weeks when love had indeed transcended death. "I'm going to keep writing in it," Caleb decided. "Not about ghosts or mysteries, just life. What we do with what he gave us." Henry smiled, the first truly peaceful expression Caleb had seen on his grandfather's face in months. "He'd like that. Your daddy always said the best stories were the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they walked back toward the trailer that would serve as temporary housing while they rebuilt. The insurance settlement, combined with their restored mineral rights, would provide more than enough to construct something better than what had been lost. But money wasn't what had saved them. Truth was, and courage, and the stubborn Morrison refusal to give up when giving up was easier. "Grandpa," Caleb said as they reached the trailer steps, "do you think he knows? That we're going to be okay?" Henry looked out across the ranch land that had been fought for, died for, and ultimately saved by love that refused to stay buried. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, probably one of their remaining mares, but the sound carried notes of recognition and goodbye that made them both smile. "I think he knows," Henry said. "I think he's been waiting 20 years to know." That night, as Caleb lay in the narrow trailer bed listening to his grandfather's gentle snoring, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents' deaths: complete peace. The nightmares were gone, replaced by dreams of building and growing and living without fear. His father's gift hadn't just been justice, it had been the chance to be a normal 8-year-old boy who happened to be extraordinarily brave. In the morning, they would begin rebuilding on ground sanctified by truth. The Morrison Ranch would rise again, stronger than before, carrying forward the legacy of a man whose love had proven more powerful than death itself.